Hi everyone, a big welcome back to the G2Z online event series. Thank you for joining us today. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. My name's Nell Thompson and I'm the coordinator of the National Getting to Zero program, or as it's referred to, G2Z. I'll be hosting the webinar for you today. However, we'll blame any glitches in Zoom or the presentation on the internet gods. Getting to Zero was developed by the Animal Welfare League of Queensland and they continue to support it to this day. G2Z offers its consulting, support and educational services at no charge to local governments and not-for-profits across Australia. Our focus continues to be on companion animal welfare and management issues such as strategy, legislation, operations, programs, and community engagement, working towards reducing intake into pounds and shelters and keeping pets in their homes. We invite people to take a look at our website at g2z.org.au, sign up for our regular e-news, connect with us via social media, and to get in contact with us to see if we can help or to have a chat about the issues that are facing your community or organisation. And so to today's presentation. Once I hand it over to our presenter, there'll be around 50 minutes of presentation and around 10 minutes of question time once the presentation has concluded. The recording of this webinar will be accessible via our website to everyone to watch at any time. We're going to ask that everyone mutes themselves during the presentation unless our presenter indicates otherwise. And if you have questions, you can start putting them in the Q&A section and we'll get through as many as we can at the end of the session. If you have very quick questions that relate to your understanding of the content, put your hand up and we'll try to get to them during the presentation. As always, please excuse any working from home background noises that may filter through. My dogs always decide to bark when I'm running a webinar. We are incredibly excited to welcome one of the shelter medicine rock stars of the world, Dr. Sarah Pizano from Team Shelter USA, as our presenter today. Sarah is the author of the Best Practice Playbook for Animal Shelters, which is now available as an ebook on Amazon and Apple Books. She's also the principal consultant and creator of Team Shelter USA, a faculty member at University of Florida, and an advisor to the Million Cat Challenge. And to be honest, I could go on for an hour about Sarah's credentials and everything that she does. She has so much energy. So over to you, Sarah, and welcome. Maybe you could tell us where you are today.
Yes, Nella, thank you so much for the invitation. I am beyond excited to be here with all of you today. I am traveling. I am in the state of Maryland, which is on the East Coast of the United States. And I do travel quite frequently, like so many of us. I have been postponed during the beginning of COVID, but I am vaccinated and back on the road. And so, like Nell said, this presentation is, I call it Best Practices for Animal Shelters, because I'm going to talk about the foundational things that I think are the most important to create a successful animal welfare program in every community. And was having trouble getting my slide advanced, but I did it. So in the United States, just to give you an idea of who I work with, we have an estimated 5,000 shelters, and they could be either public government-run shelters exclusively, they could be private nonprofit shelters, or they could be any combination of the two. So with the public shelters, they typically have a much higher intake. They do have the enforcement responsibilities when there are investigations needed around cruelty, neglect, abandonment, things like that. They have been traditionally called open admission shelter, but I'm going to talk about the exciting things that have been happening in that area. And then the private shelters are obviously run by private boards. They take donations, they operate off donations. In one community, if there are both types of shelters, they usually have a fraction of the intake. So when I was, for example, director in Miami, in Florida, my shelter was taking in my public shelter was taking in 37,000 animals, and the private nonprofit shelter was taking in 2,000 animals. So quite a big difference, but we see all kinds of combinations. I am here in Maryland. We are going to be visiting 5 shelters this week, but the first one was a private shelter with a county contract. The second one is a public shelter that has a nonprofit that helps them. So interesting dynamic and differences that help us make decisions about how we can help those shelters. But in any event, the reason why I've been asked to speak about this topic is I've done assessments across the United States, literally. The light blue are the states where I've done assessments. So over 100 of these assessments, and I'm looking at what's happening in the community and the shelter, 21 of our states. And I've been in very large urban shelters like Dallas, Texas, or Las Vegas, where their shelter was handling 40,000 animals. And then I work a lot in Kentucky, where I might be working in a county where there's 10,000 people. So very small rural shelters. What I found from this bird's eye view is that all of us share the same challenges empirically. So we have the same misperceptions as well, but thankfully the solutions are all the same. And that's the really important message. So as I was doing these assessments, I thought, well, is what I'm doing impactful? And early on, I looked at 18 of those well over 100 shelters. And I looked at the euthanasia number the year after I helped them and the year before. And I was quite shocked and humbled to see that there were 47,000 plus less euthanasias the year after the assessment than the year before. And there's two things that are important about this story. One is that the shelters were not tracking that way. And two is that I have never been a funder. And like everyone else, I thought, oh boy, to do this, we're going to need millions of dollars. We're going to need a bigger shelter, more staff. And it turns out that's number two is money. Money is number two. Practical, intelligent, strategic program design is number one. And why do we not get there? Why have we not implemented these common sense strategies in all our shelters? It's because of our own fear. So in my line of work, I do a lot of reading about psychology, human psychology, and change management, because I found that people could have 1,000 amazing things happen to them in one day. And then if they have one negative thing, that is the thing they're going to go home and complain about. They're going to go home and be upset about. They're going to have a nightmare about. And that is because our human brains not only trigger to the negative, but amplify the negative, worst case scenario. But in animal welfare, those fears are a barrier to life saving. We have this microcosm. Each of us are unique. We have our own upbringing, our own education, what we were exposed to, what we were not exposed to. And that has created our own set of beliefs. And so there's some things that I'm going to talk about in this presentation that you might think are nuts. Well, I'm with you because I thought they were nuts too 20 years ago, but it turns out we have to get out of our own way. We have to think practically and we have to really think critically. So everything that I recommend is based on the core recommendations from our own Association of Shelter Veterinarians guidelines for standards of care, the Million Cat Challenge, which I know a lot of you are part of. That's millioncatchallenge.org. Fear Free, which if you don't know about Fear Free, please join us. It is free to get certified in shelters. It's fearfreesheltering.org, and you can register your shelter and learn all these amazing ways that we in shelters can make it an easier environment for our shelter pets. And I thought I was the biggest fear-free, born fear-free, but I learned a lot in the training, and that was just 2 years ago, and I've been doing this a long time. You may have heard of the Human Animal Support Services. This has been developed as a product of COVID, and a lot of us thinking like, gosh, we need to really help shelters do things differently. So again, if you haven't heard about that, please go on the website humananimalsupportservices.org. Really lots of great information. As Nell said, I'm the author of the Best Practice Playbook, and I wanted to tell you about my assessment history since 2013 because I was writing the same reports over and over, the same recommendations, and that's why I published the playbook, which I am so excited. As of about a month ago, is on ebook, so on Amazon and Apple Books, if you'd like to order it. And this is the website again for the Human Animal Support Services. We'd love for you to join us. It's just a mecca of resources. You can have access to, gosh, I want to know what shelters do with adoption forms, and you can look up hundreds and hundreds of forms and examples from other shelters and how they're doing it. But the main thing that we want to keep in mind from the very beginning is, in a shelter, every shelter has a capacity for care. And people that don't maybe aren't very educated about animal welfare might say that's the number of cages you have. And that's part of it. Capacity for care is what I have available to me to care for the animals that come into the shelter. Yes, cage space and run space matters, but what about the number of staff I have? What about the number of volunteers I have to help? What about my life outcome programs? What about my ability to treat medical, right? So we have to balance who comes in the shelter. LOS means length of stay. We balance the number in by the length of stay with the number that is going out. And that's how we create the best environment for our shelter pets. And we want them all to live like my dog and cat there. In the United States, unfortunately, about 150 years ago, there was this very faulty plan that was made to just round up all the dogs that were running around the streets, maybe getting sick or dying of rabies and biting people. And so dogs were warehoused at shelters with no live outcome option. And we've obviously evolved in 2021 to now a 79% live outcome in our shelters. We are down to 5.3 million going into our shelters, but we still are facing overcrowding and this idea that we have to be everything to everyone, and animals continue to flood in. And then we put a lot of barriers in front of them getting out of the shelter. So it doesn't make sense. And we're going to talk about what we should be doing. But I once had a mayor in a community ask me, well, what's the big deal if they come in the shelter? And what's the big deal if they stay in the shelter? Well, any shelter, that means there's going to be negative consequences because I am going to create a situation of overcrowding. That's really stressful for animals. And now they're at risk of upper respiratory infections and other diseases because their immune system is suppressed. When animals are stressed, people are stressed. So this is just as important for us as it is for the animals. But when we are overcrowded in our shelters, we have to rush to do everything. We're not handling animals appropriately. Now we don't have the space that they need to be comfortable. So we might put too many in a space, or we might put them in a space that's too small for them. And all of these things, increase disease and all of those things, decrease our life-saving potential and creates this very negative cycle of wasting our resources, which for all of us are finite. We also have this perception that nothing is in our control. And I believe most things are in our control when we're talking about our animal shelters. And that might mean that our commissioners or our elected officials, our government officials have control to maybe change legislation. Maybe there's things in there that are blocking shelters from best practices or life saving. That is very, very common. So when I say control, I don't mean maybe the shelter director, but at some level, there is a great amount of control that we have over the system. Then there are things that are not in our control. Cruelty and neglect cases, a pandemic. I sure didn't have that on my list a couple of years ago, but that was not in our control. So I do think there are far more things in our control than not in our control. And when a shelter is working over capacity, so I'm exceeding the number of animals that I can care for humanely, I lost my ability to give them a fear free and comfortable environment. And that goes for people and for pets. I am very keen on making sure that we all use our finite, limited resources as strategically as possible. I'm one of those people that can afford to buy an expensive pair of jeans, but people, I buy my jeans in a thrift store for $1 or $3 because I feel like that's a wise investment. I can save my money for something else that's more important. But when we think about resources, yes, money is one of them, but so many other things are wrapped around this mission. Like I said, shelter space, staff. What are our partnerships? Have we capitalized or tried to collaborate with other groups? And they might not even be in animal welfare. But we have a very bad habit of saying, well, we don't have a big enough shelter. We don't have enough staff. We don't have enough money. Why don't we say, like, hey, what do we have? What do we all have? And how can we work together in neighboring communities? So it's about using whatever we have as smart as possible, working smarter, not harder, and reserving that shelter space for animals that have no other option. Now I have my fear free environment, short lengths of stay, and I'm just euthanizing animals that what I consider true euthanasia. So that means that these are large, dangerous dogs that are not safe to rehabilitate, large dogs. And then the 90% benchmark that we use here means that, again, the euthanasia pool would be dangerous dogs or medical cases beyond hope. That's cats or dogs. And it is an arbitrary percentage we use as that benchmark of 90%, right? Because it depends who's coming in the shelter. What if most of the animals, which hasn't happened yet here in the United States, do need to be euthanized? Then we might go below that 90%. That's okay. It's most important to stay true to the definition of true euthanasia. And I look at public policy first. What are the state laws? What are the highest level laws that I have to abide by or the shelter has to abide by? And then I look at the local ordinances because here at the state level, that's super hard to change and it takes sometimes years. So I'm going to go for the biggest bang for my buck, but I have to know what those laws are so that I can make the best recommendations for shelters to change their local ordinances because I cannot be in conflict with my state laws when I make recommendations with my local ordinances. So very important to be knowledgeable about your laws. This is Potato. She was at our public shelter in my community, and I said I would foster her only during COVID. And you can imagine what happened. This is her adoption party picture there, and her last name is now Pizano. And don't call me a foster failure. I am a successful adoption. So, a successful statistic. So when we look at changing laws, I'm going to not talk about life saving and I'm not going to lead with cute puppies and kittens and talk about animals. I'm going to talk to these municipal leaders about what they care about. And what they care about is constituent services. How am I going to make the public happy so I get elected again? And how am I going to stop complaints? How am I going to balance a budget and eliminate waste? They need to accomplish their goals just like we want to accomplish our life-saving goals, but I'm going to make sure that I speak their language very clearly. So I tell them how these recommendations can translate into not in just helping them, but creating positive change at the shelter. So just a couple of things that I wanted to mention. We do have some communities still in the United States that are against pit bull and bully breeds and actually have restrictions that they're not permitted in their communities, or not, the shelter is not allowed to adopt them. And we very much disagree with it. Basic racism for dogs and prejudice against dogs because of the way they look. No stray hold. And here we have a stray hold when animals come into the shelter and we don't know who owns them. So we hold them for a specific period of time. In some states, that stray hold might be 7 days. But we know that dogs are picked up by their owners, that 20%, very low percent, but 20% nonetheless, that's happening in the first 3 days. For cats, they're not getting reclaimed. And I'm going to tell you about that. And then other things. We're looking at what we can do to make sure we're addressing public and animal safety while achieving our life-saving goals and not having barriers in our ordinances. We look at what the field officers are doing. What are our enforcement teams doing? Are they giving citations for people who really don't deserve it, like a dog at large that's not causing a problem? We look at what they could do differently. And in Santa Cruz, California, this team said, let's just try to help people. Like, we think most of these issues that we're dealing with are access to care. And in fact, they were. So they started raising money and having programs where their officers actually went out to help people, and they turned their high intake areas into low intake areas. We here in the United States, we call those officers animal control officers. But what I submit, I love the title animal peace officer. And let's first see how we can help people and leave the citations and the punitive actions to those people that really deserve it. And it's a very small percent of those calls that those teams are taking. And then, of course, we want to look at how can we partner, public or private, whichever way you're going. We want everybody to work together because we cannot accomplish these goals just in the private sector, nor can we accomplish them in the private sector. So how can we capitalize? And one way is targeted spay neuter. We know that when we target specific groups of animals or people that and subsidize spay neuter, that we will decrease shelter intake everywhere, every time. Fixed income pet owners do not have the discretionary money to spay and neuter, but when we subsidize those surgeries, we know that they will take advantage of that program and therefore intake will decrease. When large breeds enter the shelters, it's much harder to place them than small dogs. So that's an important target group. And it looks different logistically and funding wise with every community. But this is a great investment for government shelters, for municipalities, because they save money and cost of care when they decrease intake. We're going to talk about community cats separate. But in any event, this example is Jacksonville, Florida. And that green line, I'm hoping you can see my arrow, but the green line going up is targeted spay neuters. The purple line going down on the top is intake at the shelters, and the red is euthanasia. So you see that it's a direct inverse correlation. The more spay neuters I do, the lower the intake and euthanasia goes. So it's an amazing correlation that we need to capitalize on. That was Jacksonville, Florida. Waco, Texas, I could lay that graph right over Jacksonville. It looks exactly the same. In Huntsville, Alabama, the bottom orange line is actually the number of surgeries. And the reason it's a line that goes straight across is because they did not have and do not have the high volume spay neuter clinics like that exist in Waco and Jacksonville. So it took them a little bit longer, but they did it with private practice veterinarians. This is what we learned when I showed you that funnel. We got to think differently. We got to use the shelter in a strategic way. How can I help people and pets in a way that does not involve shelter intake? And we call that managed admission. And I'm talking about turning that funnel around. What can we do? Can we help people with safety net? Maybe they need medical help short term. Maybe these animals can go to foster care. We are doing this big push here to try to get animals into foster homes instead of shelters. Just like we don't have orphanages anymore, we don't want to have shelters housing animals that are healthy. And so the human animal support services that I was talking about was based on that idea. Like, let's move to this community centric approach versus the shelter approach, right? So now we're taking away those, we're looking at all those options to help people and pets and not take them into the shelter, and then removing barriers to get them out. So now we stay within that capacity for care. Remember that scale I showed you. And one of the communities we helped, oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. The ASPCA did a study a couple of years ago that showed that 80% of the pet owners didn't want to surrender. They just did not have access to care. And holy cow, this was humbling and heartbreaking for me because I was judging those people and I never asked them what they needed. But once we started asking them and providing some links to resources, we don't have to pay for everything. But once we provide those links, holy cow, people really take advantage of it. The open door model is brand new. It's an access to care clinic, a veterinary a private, I'm sorry, a veterinary clinic model, a regular clinic that is also access to care, a profitable clinic. And we're proving that model now, and we're starting a really amazing national training program with that. So I'm going to focus on sheltering now, but I just couldn't help throw that in because access to care is an issue everywhere for pet owners. And the pandemic really has even pushed that further. And it's been a hardship for many pet owners, I know. But in Brevard Sheriff's Office, we said, hey, listen, try this program and ask people what they need. They're like, oh, that's not going to work here. We said, if you just help 30% of the people, that's going to be amazing. And look what they did out of the gate. 80% of the people were helped in ways other than shelter intake. Year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, they're now on year 5. And every year, they're helping 80% of the people. It's amazing. Here's another thing that we never tried. When I was public shelter director, I never thought we didn't think of this as an option, right? I've been in it 30 years. We're like, we do the same thing all the time. I don't know why I didn't think to do this, but it's an amazing idea. And this happened in Jacksonville, Florida. And now it's a really common program, but it just means that we train the public to bring animals to the shelter, but then we got stuck. We're over capacity. We use euthanasia as population control, and that's not right. Or we're just overcrowded and everybody gets stressed. How about asking the Good Samaritans, hey, can you foster them? When they did this in Jacksonville year 1, look at that tremendous increase. I mean, it's just amazing. From 456 fosters going into their program to almost 4,000. Now they have a great live outcome stream that they have mega adoption events and their animals don't stay in the shelters long, but really amazing ideas. And then the other, these are actually pretty new programs, at least Home to Home is, but I'd love for you to look at hometohome.org. This is a direct placement. So when a person wants to surrender, like, a lot of people don't want to surrender to a shelter. I'd really like to find a home, but I'm at my wit's end. I don't know how to find a home for my pet. The shelter posts them on this home to home site that's integrated into their shelter. And then the adopter and the person needing to place their pet discuss it directly and communicate directly. So it's helping them. We call it, somebody laughed and said, that's like, an online dating service. I'm like, yeah, that's what it is. And then the animals don't have to come to the shelter. Adopt a Pet Rehome is a similar thing. It's just not as personal as the home to home. So there's some differences there. And then dogs on deployment, I just threw that in there as a reminder to say there's lots of groups doing this kind of work and safety net and helping pet owners when they have to place them. Dogs on deployment here is for military families who just need help when they are maybe going on a mission, are assigned to another place short term. So fosters help their, house their pets and keep their pets for whatever number of months, and they're safe. And then when they are finished with that deployment, they get their pets back. So there's all kinds of different organizations that do that in different areas. But when we think about that managed admission, how can we help you keep replace your pet? How can we provide some safety net for you? Do we have a foster that's waiting to foster one of our amazing pets? The greatest impact to me is on those large breed dogs. And besides the community cats that I'm going to tell you about, and we've already figured that out, the large breed dogs are the most heartbreaking for me because they don't get enough enrichment in a lot of shelters, and they get very frustrated, and they behave what we call badly when they're just frustrated and stressed. So keeping them out of the shelter and hopefully in a foster home till we have a placement for them is absolutely the best. And then we talk about cats. So we thought, oh my gosh, cats, like, what are we going to do to solve the cat problem in shelters? Because we know that, oh, I thought I put my other slide here, but we know that twice as many cats are euthanized than dogs in our shelters, and that we've trained the public. If you've seen a cat outside, take it to the shelter. It must be lost so that we can find the owner. But what nobody knew way back then is that less than 2% were returned to owner or RTO'd from shelters. We also know now that about half of cat owners allow their cats access to the outside. So 80% of cats entering our shelters are community cats, and that means that's friendly or feral, so socialized or unsocialized. And again, twice as many of those cats are euthanized versus dogs. So, what is the answer? And I can promise you, 20 years ago, I thought this was insane and it would never work, but now I can't see doing it in any other way. And I can't believe I didn't come up with this myself. But here's the thing that happens is we take a lot of healthy cats that are outside into shelters, and they get stressed, they get upper respiratory, and they actually weren't in distress, but they were reproducing, and that was filling up our shelters. So the program is called Shelter Neuter Return, or SNR. There's lots of different names for it, but we call this the cat superhighway. We're not going to keep them in the shelter. We're going to sterilize them, ear tip them, vaccinate them, and put them right back where they were found, because they already are cared for based on their healthy body weight and healthy coat. We know from lots of studies, lots of numbers, so many programs, hundreds of thousands of cats in some of these studies, less than 1% were too sick, ill, or injured to put back. And then some of them, it wasn't appropriate to put them back to that location, and they had to be relocated. So, and we are always hoping and praying for your situation with outside cats in Australia. We know that it's been a big struggle there, and would love to help in any way we can. But the superhighway option for kittens is we'd love to see them adopted so that they're not on the street reproducing, perhaps becoming feral. But that doesn't necessarily mean adoptions in a shelter, because if the shelter is overcrowded, or even any shelter, it's a high risk environment for kittens. So getting them into fosters or getting them into adoptive homes right away is most important. And then for those unsocialized kittens that are already feral, we do recommend putting them back, because they're not going to be socialized. We can't unwild them, right? So there's a couple of great references. I hope you all know about kittenlady.org. She has the most amazing resources on her website. She's got tons of videos and fly all kinds of information. So kittenlady.org, if you don't know about that, she focuses on kittens under 8 weeks old, like from birth to 8 weeks old. And we just can't say enough good things about her. And then there's a great webinar that's 5 minutes. It's one of the best we've seen. It's called Leave Them Be, from Pasco County, Florida. That's another one to just train people when those kittens are nursing and somebody finds them outside, they think they're abandoned, but they're plump and healthy and clean. We know the mom just went to get something to eat, so we want them to leave those kittens in place, leave them be, because their mom can take care of them, and then we'll address sterilizing the mom and getting the kittens placed when they're old enough. But this whole process actually, it's phenomenal because it actually benefits everyone. It benefits people who have the interest in wildlife, conservation and wildlife, and advocacy, because we're talking about less cats. We're talking about sterilizing more cats, and we've proven that just trapping the cats and removing them and euthanizing them, for sure, or putting them in a home or whatever, just taking them from that environment does nothing to the issue left behind. We actually think that those left behind are having bigger litters. So we actually made it worse. But when we do this in our shelters, we have more resources for dogs, our intake goes down. So it's more financially, a fiscally responsible thing to do, and it provides sustainable resolution. So if my neighbor has 2 cats, I help them sterilize those 2 cats. Next year, I don't have 50 cats living next to me. And I'm sure a cat lover, but I don't want a cat spraying on my property. So this to me, is really a win-win-win situation for everybody involved. And these next couple of slides are what happens when you do these programs and what happens to shelter intake. So what you're looking at is each bar represents a year of outcome for cats. The green is live outcome and the blue is euthanasia. So look what happened in Nashville, Tennessee. When they started doing this program, the intake dramatically decreased and the euthanasia dramatically decreased. Same thing in Waco, Texas. They were euthanizing thousands of cats in 2012 when we got there. Very first year, dramatic decreases. And I'll say, when again, I've been in animal welfare 30 years, and way back when, boy, when I saw empty cages, I knew they were euthanized, and now I see empty cages and I'm like, oh, everybody was saved. I never thought I'd see the day when I see these dramatic changes because we changed the way we perceived and did animal welfare and animal sheltering. In Greenville, South Carolina, one of my favorite stories, because this is the first year of the program between 2015 and 2016. So you can see a dramatic decrease. The most important thing about this story is that instead of 2,000 cats being euthanized and entering the shelter, they did the 2,000 spay neuters and put them back, and it was budget neutral. So it actually didn't cost them anymore. And that's important information for our municipal leaders, and to really prove that it's really the program design when you do it intelligently and use your resources strategically. I think this webinar, the Cat Superhighway by our Million Cat Challenge team led by Dr. Kate Hurley, is truly the best one out there. So you can find that on the millioncatchallenge.org. And I will share this presentation with Nell, and so that you have access to this information and these links, or you can find it on millioncatchallenge.org. But this has all the research and studies showing that this is the only way that we can actually decrease the number of community cats. That trap and remove isn't actually an effective strategy. So all of those things I talked about, I spent most of this presentation talking about how to keep animals out of shelters, because that's really what I'm trying to do. Not really, I feel like I'm not a shelter advocate. I'm trying to keep animals out of shelters. But if they do come into the shelter, we want to make sure it's the shortest length of stay possible and the best possible environment. And so we want to advocate for that live outcome as soon as possible. What I didn't mention is with community cats, we know that their owners are not finding them. So that's why we do not want to have any kind of stray hold on them. We want them sterilized right away and put back where they were already found the following day. But for the rest of the animals or animals with no other options, the advocacy needs to start the moment they enter the shelter. We check them for identification. We post them immediately on our website and Facebook pages. We use our social media and engagement. We certainly have convenient hours for our adopters. And when adopters come to our shelter, it's a welcoming environment. It's an easy process. It's a streamlined process. And then if we, but the best thing is to have those fosters on deck, like I mentioned, so that they don't even have to stay in the shelter. And in one of the shelters that I learned about, and I know Nell knows Kristen Auerbach from, she used to be the director at Pima County, Arizona. And Kristen, at the beginning of COVID, got all their animals into foster care, and they had a list of people waiting called Foster on Deck. And animals at the beginning, for 6 months into COVID, animals were coming in and staying in the shelter less than a day, sometimes just for a couple hours, just till the Foster on Deck volunteer got there to pick them up. I'm like, that's the dream. That's where we want to get to. And they also started a doggy daycare for their fosters. So their fosters would come back during the day, have play groups and hang out and go back with their foster volunteers at night. And in the meantime, everybody's advocating for them. When they come into the shelter, we want to make sure we're doing very strict disease surveillance to catch anything. We want to make sure that we're doing rounds, making sure that the animals' needs are met, both medically, physically, emotionally, and we must have standard operating procedures. And whether we have memorandums with local veterinarians or we have veterinarians on staff, obviously the veterinarians should be creating the treatment protocols, but we want to make sure that we're catching things early before we have to deal with an outbreak, or before certainly we have to euthanize a lot of animals for something that could have been prevented. So return to home, here we are really taking a closer look at dogs, because in our shelters, we're only returning 22% of the stray dogs from shelters to their original homes. I put this guy in here because my neighbor came and said, "Hey, this dog is lost. Should I take him to the shelter?" I was like, "Heck no, give me that dog." So I walked him around my neighborhood. I found his owner inside of 30 minutes. So we want to encourage neighbors to foster and walk around their neighborhoods. We put up flyers, that put up door hangers like, "Hey, I found this dog." Follow up with any ID, of course, so that they don't end up in the shelter. We have emerging data out of several shelters that shows that those neighbors are much more successful at finding the pet's home than they are if they ended up in a shelter, which is typically far from their homes, not in their neighborhoods. It could be a half an hour away, it could be an hour away in some communities. And then, of course, it's not negotiable. We have to have enrichment. We have to have double-sided housing in our shelters. We have to have things for the pets to do in the shelter or in their cage or run. And then certainly for dogs, we are big fans of play groups. So we know now that this is another thing I thought was crazy when I first started play groups, because in my shelter we had a lot of giant dogs, we had a lot of bully breeds, and I was like, there's no way I could put 10 dogs out in that play yard together and they won't kill each other. Well, it turns out you can. And there's two amazing programs here. Dogs Playing for Life is one, Shelter Playgroup Alliance is the other. We know that when dogs, there's a great study that I heard about a couple of months ago. They looked at play groups for shelter dogs that had 45 minutes of play per day their stress hormone cortisol, those levels decreased for a full 24 hours. How amazing is that? The reactivity, the barking, all of those things were so minimized when they had the right exercise and the right play and mental stimulation, and the adoption rates go up. With shelters that have these play groups, the length of stay goes down and the adoption rates go up. So you can Google those and learn about those programs. Really amazing, amazing work being done that I'm so happy to learn about. And then remember what I said, no barriers to live outcome. And that means we need to engage with people and trust that more people are good than bad. If you have not read Adopters Welcome, please go online tonight. It's on animalsheltering.org. You can print the PDF or you can just read it online. Adopters Welcome. You can just Google it in your engine search there. It's an easy read, but I promise you this was very humbling for me. I learned a lot, and this came out in 2015. And I had misconceptions about adoptions and what made a good pet owner, how I was going to screen. And it turns out we just need to have conversations with people and help them, support them, and give them advice before the adoption and after the adoption. What is truly unfair is doing behavior temperament tests in shelter dogs in the shelter because they are in a very unnatural situation and they respond appropriately to a very unnatural situation, and they're judged harshly for it and negatively, and they're labeled dog aggressive, people aggressive, kind of whatever. And then it limits their chances of getting a great home when we now know that the behaviors in the shelter don't correlate to the behaviors in the home. And here again, I talked about bully breed discrimination. We need to stop that discrimination. This is my dog Potato getting laser surgery. Had to throw that in there to show what a fabulous pit bull she is. But just to recap, we want to think about our shelters instead of shelters and places where animals are left. We want to think about them as a resource center. We love when shelter staff are called the help team. Hello, this is the help team. Isn't that amazing to have somebody answer the phone and say, hi, this is, how can I help you? This is the help team. Like, wow, I need help. Yeah, I do need help. It's a friendly way. It's a way to partner with our communities. Managed admission is another way to partner, providing those safety net links. Our communities want to support animals not going into the shelter, right? So these are things that we want to get out there and do outreach to tell our communities it's not the best thing to house animals in shelters. We want to keep them in our foster homes or just have those direct placements like we talked about. And I can't say enough about volunteers helping in shelters. I mean, in so many shelters, the volunteers are the lifeline because shelters are typically the ones, especially the public shelters, their budgets keep getting cut and cut and cut. And if we didn't have volunteers helping, the animals wouldn't get the care that they deserve and need. So I want to thank you so much for listening. My website is teamshelterusa.com, and the playbook is now available on an ebook. So I'm so happy that you all in Australia can get it in electronic form. And I want to thank G20 and Nell. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Oh, Sarah, that was incredible. So much information. You've done so well to package that into one presentation. Amazing work.
I got in a lot. And how did I do? Oh, look at that. 50 minutes. Yeah, I did it.
You did. That was incredible. You are truly a pro at this. Very well done.
Thank you.
I have a comment here from Terry. The presentation is amazing with introductions to so many proven tools to enhance the efficacy of shelters. Hope that RSPCA and EWL, which are our big shelters here in, or some of our big shelters here in Australia, have people watching and taking notes. And I think absolutely there are lots of people watching here, Terry. So everybody keep up the good work. But I think everyone's a little bit blown away. There's nothing in the in the Q&A as yet. Everyone's like, okay, we just need to, consume all that information. I mean, the great thing is that this will be available for us all to view again, on our website, and that, you've got those extra resources that you can flick through, and we'll also post those on our website to sit with this. So we've got a question here from Rachel. That was incredible. I completely agree, Rachel. We are a rat rescue, so not everything applies, but we've learned a lot already. Any advice for short lifespan and exotics? That is an awesome question.
Yeah, it is. Guess what, though? I think all of this applies to exotics, right? I don't want them in shelters. And the other thing is that a lot of shelters with different species are not used to handling different species. So, gosh, I want to keep them in fosters and rehabbers
Mm.
where those people know that species and they get the right care. In our shelters, I do see a lot of different types of species that I'm like, this is not the right food, or this is not the right cage space for them. So I really do feel like everything that I talked about applies to other species as well. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and look, if you've got any specific questions about the rats, pop them in the Q&A box as well. But yeah, I would agree with you, Sarah. I mean, it's a sort of a holistic view for every shelter, and every species and every community. These strategies can be fitted to the community that you're particularly working in, but pretty much they're general strategies that work
Yeah.
everywhere. And Fra has said that there's no questions because it's so informative. Good on you, Fra. Thanks very much for attending. All right, we've
Thank
got a
you.
question here from Nanda. Did you get any pushback from vets in private practice, like they felt these help programs were taking away business from them? Yeah, that's quite common over here, isn't it, Nanda?
Yeah. So, absolutely, yes. So here's the thing. Unfortunately, in the United States, the private practice veterinary industry is very much siloed from animal welfare. And there really is very, very little crossover. And it's mostly, private vets say, like, well, those are the shelters or the people that can't afford it. So we don't want anything to do with them. I mentioned the open door model, and that model was created precisely because of that issue, to prove that you can do both, that you can provide access to care and still be a profitable business. And that's been amazing. We'll have an announcement now in the next couple of months, but there's two test hospitals, one in Asheville, North Carolina, and one in Toledo, Ohio. I think that we have to think about private veterinarians, at least here. The truth is that if you open, say, a low cost clinic, or you had a spay neuter clinic, or a shelter doing medical care for the community, the truth is that when you poll those people, you'll find that nearly 90% have never seen a veterinarian. And so these are not the population of pet owners that are going to a private practice. It takes the sting out of the veterinarians if you qualify those people as in need somehow. So, whether that's they're on government assistance, or they're on unemployment, or something like that. But I will tell you here, it is a constant struggle, and it's something we are in animal welfare. We're always trying to bridge that gap with the private practice veterinarians. But great question. And I'm sorry to hear that you're also struggling with that.
Yeah, we do. But I think from personal experience, I had an interesting situation where I had actually worked at the local vet clinic, And then I worked at the shelter where we had a vet clinic and provided services. And initially, the local vet clinic was very anti and very distrustful and negative about the whole thing. But in talking to them, keeping the communication lines open, they came very quickly to the understanding that we were not seeing their clients, and actually we were taking some pressure off them and providing a relief valve for them, because they then had somewhere to refer people to for clients that they couldn't help with the model that they had. So in the end, they were actually fairly grateful that they had a local shelter running a vet clinic that could provide services for those people that they actually couldn't. And so it's by keeping those communication lines open that I think just keep talking and they'll come to the realization. And if you can keep the relationship on a good even keel, you get there quicker.
Right. And now that's funny you mentioned that. So I mentioned Jacksonville, Florida, and SpayNeuter. So that I was talking about a SpayNeuter clinic. It's one of the largest in the country, 25 to 30,000 spays and neuters a year. On the corner across the street from this building is a veterinary hospital. And
Yeah,
that hospital was there already. And guess what? His business exploded in a good way
yeah,
because the clinic was so busy. They weren't doing medical care. They were doing spay neuter in the beginning. Now they're doing a lot of medical care too. But guess what? There's enough business for both of them. And that veterinarian has never done better. So
yeah.
there's those stories too that I love to tell, especially, private practice veterinarians. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Fra says, I appreciate the few examples of responsible public policy that were provided. Can you recommend where we can do more research in this space? That's an excellent question, Fra.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my playbook has an entire chapter. I have to plug the playbook, but I mean, the truth
Yeah,
is I'm
the
sitting here
playbook
going,
is
what other
great.
resources? Yeah, so it's there's an entire chapter on legislation and there's charts. And one chart is here's what to do and why. And then the other chart is here's what not to do and why. Because our elected officials there's a problem and they create this um, public policy that makes absolutely no sense. But they think it's going to prevent whatever just happened. But
Yeah,
they're totally wrong. So I think that the playbook is a really good place to start because that chapter is just the basics and here's what you need to think about. But I promise you that it is very common with especially elected officials and municipalities. Like, here is my goal, and this is where I'm going this way, right? So it's been amazing to watch. And why do they do that? Guess what? They don't know what we know. They don't
yeah,
have the data, they don't have the trends. So we're the ones that have to educate them, right? So I remember meeting with an attorney, and she said, well, we can't eliminate the stray hole for cats. We want the owners to be able to find them. I said, perfect, we have the same goal. Out of the 15,000 stray cats that came into your shelter last year, do you know how many you reunited? She did not. And the
no,
number was 37. So she did not know that. So I said, we have the same goals, but your strategy has nothing to do with that goal.
mm,
It's not helping you, right? So
yeah,
always remember that we have the information that they need to make the best decision.
yeah, absolutely. And Fra, reach out. We can absolutely help you with that as well. Rachel Greenfield, a huge reason for surrender for rats is not being able to afford exotics vet care. And often
Yeah.
they're surrendered specifically because they're sick. 95% of our fundraising goes straight to a private vet. So community support mitigating intake sounds brilliant. But what do you do when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of procedure costs?
You know what? I don't think there really is any magic bullet. I
Mm,
think you're doing everything that you possibly can by raising that money to
yeah,
help with the medical care so that they don't get surrendered. And I think so. I can't think of anything else you could do. I think that is where you should be investing, yeah, your
yeah.
money.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to pay for medical costs, and look, everybody, this applies for cats and dogs as well. I think we have passed the days of having people surrender their pets because they can't afford the medical costs for whatever is going on with them. And then we fix it up. We pay the medical costs anyway, but then we adopt it out to another family. Why are we doing that? We need to look at keeping these pets with their families and not judging them for the fact that they can't afford that medical care. We're going to pay for it anyway, so let's keep them with their original family and keep that space open in our shelter facility.
And now you know what? You're exactly right. So we're still doing the same thing in the United States. We're taking the animals in, fixing them, and doing whatever,
Yeah.
and giving them to another adopter, right? So yeah, we're doing that is the norm, still the norm, I
Right.
would say.
Right. Yeah. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion, and look at that. We are bang on 12:01. I reckon this is first time for us doing this. Sarah, you are incredible. Thank you so much. Everybody, thank you so much for attending. We really appreciate it, and we very much appreciate Sarah taking her evening, getting great feedback in the chat. Thank you, everybody. So
Thank
we're aiming to
you.
have these events on a regular basis. Make sure you're signed up for our e-news and that we're connected on social media so that you get the announcements about future webinars in the series. And feel free to send us through suggestions for topics or speakers that you'd like to see featured. Sleep well, Sarah. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody,
Thanks,
and
Mel.
take care. Okay, bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.